The lights in the newsroom were still hot when the message reached my desk. 3 short sentences, no preamble, no press release, just a single encrypted feed coming through the crisis wire. European Council votes unanimous. Russian oil assets seized. Nationalization, effective immediately. I froze. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Every LED screen, every ticker, every producer in the control room turned toward me, as if the air itself demanded narration. I had read thousands of statements in my life. Wars declared, governments fallen, currencies collapsing, but this one tasted different. It tasted of reckoning. That night wasn't about oil. It wasn't about economics. It was about the one thing every empire forgets: consequences. The weight of a single word seized. Such a small, sharp word. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't apologize. It doesn't blink. It slices history in 2. On one side, decades of dependence, whispers of corruption, energy pipelines turning into political leashes. On the other, silence, rupture, cold clarity. I had covered the first contracts years ago, when men in expensive suits shook hands under chandeliers, promising mutual prosperity. I remember the smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They thought they were buying security. They were selling sovereignty. And now those same handshakes were ghosts. Betrayal has a sound. People imagine betrayal as a scream. It's not. It's a click. The sound of a pen signing the wrong deal. The sound of a valve shutting for the last time. The sound of a nation realizing it has been paying for its own chains. Could almost hear it echo across the continent, the collective exhale of citizens who finally saw through the facade. They had been told for years that dependence was stability, that compromise was diplomacy, that comfort was peace. But comfort had turned into addiction. Addiction had turned into leverage, and leverage had turned into blackmail. Now the spell was broken. Suspense in the streets outside the studio. Sirens wailed, not from panic, but from the crowd gathering in the cold November rain. People were lighting flares in front of the embassies. Blue and gold flags fluttered beside the deep red banners of defiance. Voices overlapped like thunder. Not another drop of stolen fire. I stepped out to the balcony. The air was electric with disbelief and something older, vengeance disguised as relief. For months, maybe years, Europe had watched itself through the reflection of fear. Now it saw itself in the mirror of defiance. And defiance once ignited doesn't extinguish easily. A confession. Let me tell you something I've never said on air. I once believed neutrality was my duty. That my voice was a bridge, not a weapon. But tonight, neutrality felt like betrayal. Because when you see a continent chained by greed and decide silence is professional, you're not reporting, you're collaborating. That realization burned in me. It stripped away the illusion of objectivity and left only the raw question every journalist must face. Which truth are you willing to stand for when the sponsors walk away? The heartbreak. Behind the headlines, somewhere in Eastern Europe, a refinery went dark. Hundreds of workers, mechanics, welders, mothers, sons, waited outside the gates. Their livelihoods had been tied to companies whose logos no longer existed. I saw one woman clutch a lunchbox like a relic. She whispered, "At least my children will know who owns our future now." That's when it hit me. This story wasn't about punishment. It was about reclamation. Heartbreak always follows justice. Because justice doesn't erase pain. It redistributes it. Someone always pays. The flicker of revenge. Every revolution begins with grief disguised as patience. And patience, once it runs dry, becomes vengeance in motion. Europe had been patient. Too patient. Years of sanctions that half-worked, negotiations that bought time, and winters that reminded them who controlled the heat. But tonight the patience ended. This wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Every seizure, every frozen account, every red-stamped decree was the movement of a continent reclaiming its narrative. Revenge here wasn't violence. It was reversal. For once, power flowed upstream. The lesson beneath the flames as the first oil convoys halted. Markets shook and the world gasped. Commentators called it reckless, short-sighted, emotional. But beneath that chaos lay a message carved in steel. You cannot build peace on dependence. Dependence makes slaves. Ownership makes citizens. And the true wealth of a nation isn't what flows under its soil. It's the courage flowing in its people. A personal reckoning, standing before the cameras. I felt the tremor of history beneath my feet. The script in my hand was shaking, not from fear but from awe. How many times had I announced historic decisions that meant nothing? How many times had I mistaken endurance for progress? Tonight I wasn't just reporting history. I was watching a continent rewrite its destiny, and I whispered to myself, barely audible over the roar of the crowd, "This is what awakening sounds like. To be continued, that was only the beginning. Because the moment you seize something, the world asks what you'll do with it. In the next chapter, when the dust settles, when greed tries to reinvent itself, when the same hands that once sold the chains now offer to polish them, what happens then? That is where the real battle begins." Morning came like a verdict. The headlines had already spread across every feed, every phone, every boardroom. Markets opened, not with the usual hum of speculation, but with the static crackle of disbelief. Somewhere the world's richest men woke up to discover that their invisible empires had vanished overnight. And yet, outside my window, the city looked ordinary. Coffee lines, buses, wet pavement. It always shocks me how normal the apocalypse looks from ground level. I walked into the newsroom to the rhythm of incoming updates. Colleagues whispered like survivors in a cathedral after the organ stops. We all knew what this meant. A new world order was being assembled in real time, and we were inside its broadcast tower. The architecture of betrayal. I used to think betrayal was sudden. It isn't. It's built, brick by brick, in the quiet rooms where no one keeps minutes. Decades earlier, those same oil conglomerates had sponsored scholarships, think tanks, cultural festivals. They funded art about peace while drilling into the bones of nations. They bought words before they bought wells. We all participated. Every flight, every car ride, every glowing screen, powered by what we refused to question. And now, as governments confiscated their assets, the public pretended surprise. But the truth? We had signed the contract too. Each time we chose convenience over conscience. When betrayal finally collapses, it doesn't feel like shock. It feels like recognition. The suspense of silence phones rang non-stop. Diplomats, executives, anonymous insiders offering off-record panic. Then silence. No statements from Moscow. No clarifications from Brussels. That silence grew so thick I could almost hear the sound of waiting. The collective pause between cause and consequence, waiting, is the heaviest sound in journalism. It's heavier than gunfire, heavier than speeches. Because waiting means everyone knows something irreversible has begun, and nobody dares describe it yet. I stared at the red light of the camera, live on air, and said only, "Europe wakes to a morning without compromise, no adjectives, no spin. Sometimes truth needs silence around it to breathe." Heartbreak in the background. Later that afternoon, I visited a refinery on the outskirts of the city. The gates were open, guards gone, the air still smelled of fuel and rain. Workers stood in small circles, smoking, their faces a mixture of pride and fear. Some carried boxes of personal items, photographs, helmets, family drawings. Others refused to leave, as if their presence could guard the future they had just been promised. A mechanic, maybe 50, looked at the new flag hanging above the entrance and said quietly, "All my life I worked for a company that never knew my name. Maybe now the land will." I had nothing to reply. Journalists aren't supposed to cry, but sometimes your throat betrays you before your eyes do. Heartbreak isn't only loss, it's the sudden awareness of how long you've lived without belonging. Revenge in the corridors of power. That evening, government spokespeople appeared on every screen, crisp suits and careful diction. They called the seizures protective measures, energy security initiatives, stabilization efforts. But beneath the rhetoric, the message was simple: we remember. For years, Europe had been humiliated by its dependence. Every winter a negotiation, every contract a quiet surrender. Now the continent spoke the language of consequence. In one parliament after another, politicians who had once defended strategic partnerships tore up their own words on camera. Some cried, some trembled, some smiled as if tasting freedom for the first time. Revenge had arrived wearing the mask of policy, but revenge, even justified, carries a price tag. I could feel it humming underneath the applause. The emotional ledger by midnight, the stock markets were bleeding. Energy prices spiked, investors panicked, pundits shouted into microphones about economic suicide. I understood their fear. Power never disappears quietly. It screams while leaving. Yet in the midst of chaos, I noticed something miraculous. Ordinary people didn't panic. In cafes, strangers offered to share generators. Farmers volunteered fuel from private reserves to keep hospitals running. Students delivered firewood to elderly neighbors. Solidarity, an ancient, almost forgotten muscle, was being exercised again. That night I wrote in my notebook, "Revenge purges corruption. Solidarity rebuilds the soul." The mirror moment around 3 a.m., I looked into the studio mirror, the face staring back. The morning after the summit, I walked through streets still littered with old posters, slogans that no longer matched the world we'd woken up in. The people were quiet, not out of fear but reflection, the kind of silence that follows a storm when everyone's heart is still learning what peace feels like. It wasn't triumph that filled the air. It was responsibility. We had taken back control, but now the real question hung like frost on every window pane. What will we do with it? 1. The ghosts of the old order. In the days that followed, the fallen oligarchs became shadows of rumor. Some fled across borders, others tried to barter secrets for safety. But the most haunting ghosts weren't the men who fled. They were the systems they had built. The pipelines of corruption ran deeper than oil fields. They ran through education, culture, and even our definition of success. For years we had measured progress by profit, not by purpose. And when you measure worth by what you own, not by what you build, betrayal becomes inevitable. As I stood once again in front of the camera, the world watching, I realized this story was no longer about geopolitics or economics. It was about human transformation. We had dismantled an empire not by bombs but by conviction. And conviction, when shared by millions, is the most unstoppable energy source on Earth. We are not punishing the past, I said on air. We are correcting it. Those words echoed through the broadcast like a prayer and a warning. Because when justice arrives, it doesn't ask for permission. It demands participation. 2. The price of freedom. Freedom, I've learned, is not granted. It's rented. And the rent is due every generation. People love to celebrate revolutions. The banners, the chants, the promises of a cleaner dawn. But they rarely talk about the maintenance of freedom, the discipline, the vigilance, the humility. The oil companies once owned our dependence. They dictated not just prices, but choices. They taught us that power was a privilege, not a birthright. Now with nationalization, we face the other extreme, power in our own hands. But hands too can become greedy. I reported from the new National Council that had been formed to oversee the transition. Inside, idealists debated engineers, economists clashed with activists. It was messy, loud, human, and beautiful. No one was completely right and no one was completely wrong. That's what freedom looks like. The measure of our success, I told viewers, will not be in the fall of the old order, but in the rise of our integrity. 3. The fire within one night. I was invited to speak at a community hall in Warsaw, a gathering of workers, students, and teachers. They wanted to hear about the change, about the nationalization, about hope. But when I stepped on stage and saw their faces, tired, curious, alive, I knew they didn't need an update. They needed a reminder. So I said, power is not a throne. It's a torch. And a torch only matters if you pass it forward. The crowd stayed silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into applause that shook the old plaster walls. In their cheers, I heard something deeper than celebration. It was recognition. The sound of people remembering they were never powerless. That's when I understood. The nationalization wasn't the end of oppression. It was the end of permission. Permission to be small, permission to stay silent, permission to accept exploitation as destiny. We had revoked permission, and once people realize they have that right, no empire survives long enough to recover. 4 lessons from the rubble. In journalism, we're taught to find the angle, the headline, the hook. But some stories don't fit into frames. They expand beyond them. I traveled across Europe in the months after the seizure. In Portugal, I saw fishermen forming co-ops to power their villages with wind energy. In Finland, I met teenagers designing solar grids for Arctic settlements. In Germany, former refinery workers were teaching high school students how to build clean tech engines. Everywhere I went, I saw the same truth. When greed leaves, ingenuity enters. Betrayal had forced us to evolve. Heartbreak had cleared our vision, and revenge, that burning, blinding force, had transformed into something rarer. Resolve. 5. The mirror of redemption. Months later, I was invited to moderate an international forum titled Ownership and the Future of Civilization. A grand name for a humble question. Who really owns the world? The panelists argued, economists citing data, politicians citing ideals. When my turn came, I didn't speak from my notes. I spoke from the story that had changed me. We used to think ownership was about possession, I said. But true ownership is about stewardship. You don't own what you exploit. You own what you protect. The audience went quiet. Because deep down they knew it too. We had been tenants of greed for so long, we'd forgotten what stewardship felt like. 6. The personal reckoning. Late that night after the forum, I sat alone in the studio. The monitors were dark. The only sound was the slow hum of the city outside, a live, uncertain rebuilding. I thought of my career, the years spent reporting wars, markets, elections, all the noise that hides the human story beneath. And I realized something. This time the biggest story wasn't the collapse of corporations. It was the rebirth of conscience. We had looked at the machinery of exploitation and said, enough. And in doing so, we had rediscovered something sacred. Agency. Agency isn't loud. It doesn't shout slogans or wave flags. It whispers, you matter. Your choice matters. Your courage matters. That whisper, multiplied by millions, becomes a roar that changes history. 7. The new dawn weeks later, I returned to that same refinery where it all began. The new sign read, National Energy Cooperative. The workers, the same ones who once feared losing their jobs, now owned part of the company. They voted on decisions. They planned expansions. They planted trees near the old chimneys. A little girl was running near the gate, her laughter echoing in the cool spring air. Her father, one of the engineers, smiled and told me, for the first time, I'm not afraid of the future. I'm part of it. That line stayed with me all the way back to the newsroom, because that's what the revolution had truly delivered. Not wealth, not victory, but participation. The freedom to belong to something honest. 8. The return to broadcast. On the anniversary of the seizure, I was asked to deliver a live address, and not as a reporter, but as a witness. The camera's red light blinked. For a moment I hesitated. Then I spoke the words I'd waited my entire career to say. We once believed that oil powered the world. We were wrong. What powers the world is courage. The courage to tell the truth, to confront corruption, to rebuild with compassion. Oil can be extracted, but courage must be cultivated. The control room stayed silent again, like that first night. But this time the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt whole. I continued. Every generation inherits a broken system. Some complain, some surrender. But a few, a rare, unshakable few, decide to fix it. They face betrayal and heartbreak and keep walking. They replace greed with grit, fear with faith, and power with purpose. My voice trembled, but I didn't hide it, because authenticity is the only weapon stronger than propaganda. Look around you, I said. We are not witnessing the end of an era. We are witnessing the beginning of accountability. 9. The universal lesson. Long after the broadcast ended, I kept thinking about that one word, accountability. It's not political. It's personal. Every person, every nation, every company must face it eventually. Because the universe doesn't reward arrogance. It rewards awareness. The moment we admit we were wrong, we become right again. That's redemption. Not perfection, but correction. And maybe that's the real meaning behind the nationalization, behind the struggle, behind the entire human story. We fall to rise more wisely. The betrayal that once broke us becomes the mirror that rebuilds us. 10. The final broadcast. A letter to the future. As the night deepened, I wrote one last message, not for the news, but for the next generation who would someday study this era. It read, "Dear future, we were imperfect. We were blind. But we learned that courage is not born in victory. It's born in loss. We learned that truth, though often buried, has roots stronger than lies. We learned that wealth without humanity is poverty in disguise. And we learned that when people unite, even empires made of oil and steel must kneel before the power of conscience." I folded the note and placed it in my journal, not as a relic, but as a reminder. 11. The closing vision years from now. When children ask what it felt like to live through this turning point, I'll tell them. It felt like standing at the edge of an old world and watching light break through its cracks. It felt like realizing that history isn't written by those who win, but by those who learn. And I'll tell them something else, something every soul needs to hear once in a lifetime. Do not fear collapse. Fear comfort that keeps you silent, because nations, like people, don't die from crisis. They die from complacency. The collapse of corruption was painful, yes, but it gave birth to clarity. And clarity is the rarest, most revolutionary energy source of all. 12. The final words. I looked once more into the camera, not as a broadcaster, but as a believer. To those who built the old world, may you find humility. To those rebuilding the new one, may you find wisdom. And to those who still doubt that justice can prevail, look around you. It already has. The studio lights dimmed. Outside, dawn was rising. Pale gold over the horizon, steady, patient,